Hello, I'm Luca Coasters, and today I'll be reviewing Skyrush at Hersheypark. Skyrush is a 61 meter tall Intamin wing hypercoaster which opened back in 2012. It was one of only two coasters to feature these trains, and these are definitely the most controversial part of the ride. Skyrush is definitely a divisive coaster, with half the community saying that the restraints are unbearable, but the other half not minding them, and some people even think that they improve the ride. Personally, I love the open over-the-head lap bars on Skyrush, as they provide so much freedom, and they work really well for Skyrush, even though they can get a bit uncomfortable. So I first went to Hersheypark in August 2019, for an evening and then a full day after. And on the first evening, Skyrush was down the whole time, and even for most of the second day, Skyrush was still down. But at around 5 PM it reopened and I got straight in line. The queue line is fairly basic, as this ride doesn't really feature a theme, but it doesn't need one. For Skyrush you can either choose the front row queue or a queue for the rest of the rows, but often the line for front row is much longer than the other rows. When you get to the station, the rows are allocated on a first come first served basis, so you can choose your row if it's not occupied. And my favourite row on Skyrush was by far the back row, but every row is still great on this coaster. The station has a very interesting setup, as you load and unload on the same side of the station, which can make dispatches a bit messy. The actual train has 4 across seating with 2 wing seats and 2 regular seats in the middle. I recommend trying both, but I definitely prefer the wing seats just because they feel even more open. The seats are fairly comfortable, but unfortunately the restraints don't really conform to your legs too well, which can make it slightly uncomfortable. But because of the nature of the overhead lap bars, they're really open and the dispatches are also fairly fast, even with the seat belts. When the train dispatches, it slowly goes forward, and then when it connects to the cable lift, the train fairly suddenly accelerates. This lift hill ends up being so fast that in the back row, when you start going up, you feel some mild positives, which is definitely a weird sensation. This is one of the fastest lift hills in the world, but towards the top you do slow down a bit. However, around the opening it didn't actually slow down as much towards the top, but since then they have slowed it down at the top, which is understandable. However, you are still going at a decent speed over the crest of the lift hill as you begin the 61 meter descent. So at the start of this drop you get some mild floater on the front and some solid ejector on the back, and then you hit the so-called bump. I had fairly high expectations for this bump, as I'd heard so many great things about it in videos, but really nothing could prepare me for what was in store. At the halfway point down the drop, if you're in the back row, you'll get a ridiculously strong, violent burst of ejector which mercilessly throws you out of your seat and forwards. It honestly feels like you're going to fly out at this moment, as it's just so strong. This is definitely the strongest airtime moment that I've ever experienced on a coaster, and this drop is by far my favourite element on any coaster. Nothing could prepare me for how insane it was, as most POVs didn't even show this subtle bump, and it's hard to put into words just how insane this element is. I would say that this amazing POV of Skyrush in the back row by Angelo Gars is the best depiction of the insanity of this drop, as you can really see how suddenly the riders are launched out of their seat. I honestly watch this POV way too often, as it really is one of the best POVs of any coaster, and it really just shows how wild Skyrush is. To be fair, in the front row, the ejector on the drop is a bit more mild, which is part of the reason why back row is the best on this coaster. Being on a wing seat just makes this element that bit more intense if it wasn't already insane enough. You are pinned against a restraint before being slammed back into your seat in one of the strongest moments of positives on any coaster. This valley pulls around 5G, and the contrast in forces from the drop to this valley is so big. You go from one of the strongest moments of ejector on any coaster to one of the strongest moments of positives in under a second. And the sudden transition from the strong ejector to the strong positives is a recurring theme in this coaster, and it really gives the ride an aggressive non-stop feel. If that wasn't enough, the base of this valley is also banked slightly too much, so it gives some really strong lats, which if you aren't holding on will force you to the right and towards the ground. This element on the right side of the train is crazy, as you're already so close to the ground, and these crushing laterals will push you even closer to the ground. This moment of laterals really caught me off guard on my first ride, and at this point I'd not braced for the element, so I was completely folded over to the side thanks to the open trains with almost no lateral bracing. These moments of laterals are really enhanced by the trains, as they're so open, and as I said they have pretty much no lateral bracing, so you really get thrown around, even if you're holding on. The train then rises up into the first hill, and this hill is fairly shallow, low to the ground and drawn out. This then allows the airtime to be strong and sustained, whilst also making the transition into the airtime much more sudden. So within a second you go from crazy positives and laterals back to some crazy ejector, The transition into the ejector is fairly violent in all rows, and because of the shaping of the element, the airtime is so consistent throughout the whole hill, you just experience incredibly strong air for a couple of seconds. This airtime hill is somehow stronger than any other sustained airtime hill on other coasters, and the only sustained airtime hills that I've experienced that are stronger than this hill are later in the ride. Yes, I found this airtime to be stronger than any airtime found on El Toro, Expedition G-Force, and even every single RMC that I've experienced. I'd say this first hill in particular almost feels like Expedition G-Force's second hill, but much stronger. You will just hold out of your seat before being crushed back into your seat in a great moment of sustained positives. The positives in this turn aren't nearly as strong as those in the first valley, but they're still very strong, and they have the advantage of being more sustained. It feels very similar to the helix on Phoenix at Toverland, and towards the end of this turn I did begin greying out. During this turn you also experience some mild laterals, which aren't too violent, but it does add a little variation to this turn, making it even more exciting. The train then rises up into the second sustained hill, which passes directly under the first. This hill is slightly stronger than the first, so you're catapulted out of your seat yet again. This is added to by a great head chopper with the track of the first hill above, so it's being violently launched towards the track earlier in the ride, making for one of the best head choppers on any coaster. Unfortunately, this hill is less sustained than the first, but the strength of the ejector is still unmatched by any other ride. It's hard to describe the sheer power of this airtime. Whilst it doesn't quite match the airtime found on the drop, it is still incredibly strong, and it honestly doesn't feel like it should even be legal. Even though you're pretty much guaranteed to have no room by this point in the ride, you can still feel yourself lifting up, and honestly, these airtime moments would not feel at all safe with any amount of room. You then fall back in your seat as the train enters another turn. This turn is slightly less forceful than the previous turn, but then you also experience some mild laterals during this turn as well, which build up as you traverse this element. You are being pushed to the left as you rise into the Stanky dive, and then you feel a powerful spike of laterals which violently force you to the left, before the train suddenly descends and banks to the right, giving a nice moment of ejector and some more aggressive laterals which now throw you to the right. These laterals are accentuated by the fact that you go from strong laterals in one direction to strong laterals in the other direction, so during this element you're really being thrown around from side to side so much, and the ejector just makes this element that much better. Despite the transition not being too whippy, the laterals are somehow so strong, and in a wing seat this element is unforgiving. It then takes a couple seconds to recover from the lats. Before you can even recover, the train enters a banking hill. At this point on my first ride, I thought if this ride gets any more intense, then it could honestly be a bit too much, as during this whole ride it straddles the line of fun insanity and then being too much. In this banking hill, you experience a mild jolt of ejector whilst being powerfully launched to the left as the train twists. In the wing seats you are absolutely folded over, and it really feels like you're going to fly out of the train at this point. This is where the ride really enters the territory of being slightly too much, and for me this is where the ride gets really good. After that ridiculous element, you go through a short right hand turn which sustains some of the laterals, but it doesn't have the best positives. This allows you to recover slightly from the previous element, but the positives and laterals in this turn mean you can't really fully recover that much before being thrown into the next element. While still being pinned to the left, the train rises up into the twisted hill. The laterals build up so you're violently pushed to the left side of the train, although these laterals aren't as strong as the previous hill. The train then crests the twisted hill and aggressively snaps to the left, simultaneously throwing you up, forwards and to the right. This airtime feels on par with the previous hill, but then for some reason you're thrown forwards and then yanked from left to right in a strong dose of laterals which will again fold you over to the side if you aren't holding on. This element is just so violent, and it manages to have strong forces in every single direction simultaneously, so you're just thrown around like a ragdoll. As soon as you exit that element, you're launched into the final and strongest hill of the ride. This hill has relatively steep sides and is more compact, meaning that the airtime is less consistently strong throughout the hill, but you are still violently flung upwards. In the front, the transition into the ejector is really sudden, but in the back, the airtime starts with a fairly quick transition into the strong ejector, and then during the hill, the airtime builds up even more. Usually I don't like these styles of hills as much, as they take longer to build up into the air, but on Skyrush the airtime already starts off so strong, that this inconsistently honestly makes the element feel even more aggressive if anything. This is definitely the strongest airtime hill on the ride, but it doesn't quite match the drop in terms of airtime strength, but this hill is still the second strongest moment of airtime that I've ever experienced. You then fall back in your seat and go through a fun overbank which is nothing too special compared to the rest of the ride, and after that you go through a drawn out turn, as the train navigates its way to the brake run. But by this point the ride is pretty much over, and the slow turn just gives you some time to recover from the insanity of Skyrush. So for me this turn doesn't really affect the pacing too much, as I don't really take it into account, if that makes sense. So then the train slides into the brake run, and to be fair here the restraints can be quite uncomfortable, but then the ride goes through a shallow turn into the second brake run, which is where the restraints pop up slightly, making this brake run a bit more comfortable. So overall, this ride is just crazy. From the first drop to the final hill, you are just experiencing constant, strong forces in every single direction. There is no ride that I have ridden which even comes close to the insanity of Skyrush, so Skyrush is just on its own level. This ride almost takes it too far, and I can understand why some people might find it to be a bit too much, but for me that is what makes a ride so great. I've also heard some people talk about a rattle on this ride, and whilst this ride isn't perfectly smooth, it's by no means rough. You can definitely feel the train on the track, and on the turn after the first hill the train shakes a bit, but on the outer seats it is no rougher than the inside seat of a regular B&M wing coaster, and for me it didn't really affect the quality or the re-rideability of the ride. To be fair, for me, this ride isn't the easiest to marathon, just because of how insane the forces are, and the huge rush that it creates. So between each ride, I needed a few minutes to break, especially since I could walk straight on the ride because of the fast lane I had, which allowed me to get 9 rides on this coaster despite it not being open for most of my visit to Hershey. As I said before, the restraints didn't really affect the ride negatively for me, as they only really caused discomfort at the end, and if anything the restraints benefit the ride. They are just so open, which really enhances the airtime and especially the laterals. The shape of the bars themselves aren't optimal, but the only real improvement I could see for the trains is to retrofit them with the new gen Intamin lap bars. So for me, Skyrush is an almost perfect ride, and the few flaws that it has, such as the ending, the restraints, and the slight shakiness, are so minor that they don't really affect the overall ride experience for me. Skyrush really pushes the limits of forces on roller coasters in every single direction. It has the best laterals and airtime of any coaster that I've experienced, and still some of the best positives I've experienced. Not to mention that drop, which is again my favourite element on any coaster, by far. I highly doubt that anything this extreme will ever be built again, but I sure am thankful this coaster got built in the first place. I'm going to have to give Skyrush an extremely high score of 99 out of 100. This is a close contender for my number 1, and I highly recommend this coaster to all enthusiasts. Although it's polarising, there isn't a ride which delivers forces quite like it. So, I'd love to hear your opinions on Skyrush down in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed this video then make sure to like and subscribe for more roller coaster based content.